Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second live session of the Q&A for the Climate Action Solutions for a Changing Planet. My name is Elena Cree. I work with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, or SDSN. So I have worked with these 23 professors over the last year to bring this course to you. And today I'm here with Stephanie McClellan from the University of Delaware. So we're now in the 7th week of the course. We've covered a range of topics from the Paris Climate Agreement, deep decarbonization, and looking at case studies from Canada and Australia and Russia. And now getting a bit more into the technology. Last week, we went into the renewables and low emission electricity sector. That was where Stephanie's module came up, where she talked about wind. So today she's with us. Just a quick reminder, this is a live session. So we do have a few questions that were already submitted by students, but please feel free to type in the chat on YouTube. I'm going to do the best I can to kind of funnel those to Stephanie and keep the conversation going. But really anything that comes to mind from either the chapter or during our conversation, just type it in and we'll get to it within the next hour, hopefully. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie and just ask her to introduce herself, tell us a little bit more about the special initiative of offshore wind at the University of Delaware, and kind of your backstory of how you got to where you are today. So Stephanie?
Hi, Elena, and thanks everyone for having me. Nice to be here this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are. Or this evening, I guess. So yeah, I run an organization called the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind at the University of Delaware. It is a university-based and philanthropy-funded program to advance offshore wind in the United States. We do a lot of international work, really more learning the lessons and bringing the knowledge from other areas of the world to the US. But our specific mission is to advance offshore wind in the United States. When I say philanthropy funded, what I mean is that we don't take funding, or we're not supported by industry, and being both philanthropy funded and university based gives us a real independence. We work with industry, we work with NGOs, we work with policymakers at both the state and federal level in the United States, and we have a real level of independence so that we're not a trade association. So my background, I am actually a policy person and not as much a science or technology person, though I certainly have had my fair share of exposure to that since getting involved in offshore wind. Prior to starting the offshore wind, the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind, I did have a stint with an offshore wind transmission developer. So I worked for the Atlantic Wind Connection, which was a Google-backed proposal to build an offshore transmission line that would connect offshore wind farms up and down the East Coast. Before that, I was the director of director of strategic initiatives and outreach at the Atlantic Wind Connection. And I actually got involved in offshore wind when I worked as the policy director for the governor of Delaware, Jack Markell. From 2009 to 2011. Delaware was the first state with a power purchase agreement for offshore wind in the United States. Everybody thinks the first offshore wind farm that was proposed was Cape Wind, and it was, but the first project that really had momentum and looked like it was going to happen was here in Delaware. And as the governor's policy director, I became a point person on offshore wind and really became both immersed in the field and also really connected to the network of state and federal officials that were working to advance offshore wind in this country. So after leaving political appointee office, I really immersed myself in offshore wind and have wound my way back into the university to run this program. So that's a little bit about who I am and a little bit about what we do.
Very interesting, quite a rich history and a rich, pathway there. So I guess we'll start kind of just a bit more generically, but so in your course, you covered a lot of different technologies, offshore wind, onshore wind, and even some of those really cool airborne kites and the like. So could you just maybe talk a little bit more about what's, the latest and greatest? Where is wind heading? What is the really exciting areas today?
Well, at the risk of just kind of going back to the premises in the lecture, because I was really jazzed up when I was looking at all that information to put it together for this, because that really is kind of the latest and greatest. We have so little offshore wind here in the United States, but such a huge opportunity. Globally, we have such an opportunity with the airborne wind, which I really think is probably the most interesting and the real game changer that we can really get into, because we can generate really large amounts of renewable energy as we go up to higher altitudes and pick up higher wind speeds. And I think the latest and greatest, in all of this is the R&D and the efforts to bring the cost down. So when I said I'm a policy person, I look first and foremost at what's it going to take to actually get it done. And when we talk about really being able to advance these technologies and implement them in a way that makes them scalable, that makes them something that we're actually using, the economics of these kinds of projects have to work. And so the R&D efforts that are underway to bring the cost down, like we've already seen them come down in onshore wind across the world. But I think there might have been a table or a figure in that video lecture of the cost curve and how the cost curve came down with onshore wind as we ramped up the amount of wind that we were deploying. And so at this point, onshore wind is cheaper than fossil fuel in many places. It is the most competitive resource that we have out there, and we need to make that happen for these other wind technologies, the other technologies that we can use to harness energy from the wind. And so the most exciting work that's going on out there, in my opinion, is that work that helps to change the economics of those projects and help us to be able to implement it.
So would you say that was more a result of just the markets and economies of scale, or were there actual policies? I mean, in Europe, obviously, this is much more popular than in the US, but maybe that's also changing, better than I do. But are there kind of silver bullet policies that have really worked to push this technology forward?
Well, I would say that it's a combination of the R&D into the technology. So bigger turbines that are going to capture more energy from the same amount of wind in the same location. So that is kind of the first piece of this, is getting the technology to the point where they're more efficient. That we talk about capacity factors. That's the wind is blowing, you put a machine out there, but you're not going to generate 100%, one of the nameplate capacity of a wind turbine, for example. Land-based wind, the capacity factor is generally around 20 to 30%, which has increased over time. Offshore wind, they started at about 40%, now we're at 50%. So just getting more out of the turbine is the sort of the R&D work that needs to happen. And of course that takes funding. It takes federal funding. Here in the United States, the Department of Energy has been a driver of that. It takes industry funding. And so that's a policy. If we think of that, funding choices or funding opportunities that are made by the government, if we consider that policy, which I do, that's a really important policy. And we've seen that in the United Kingdom. We've seen that in Europe, where organizations like the Carbon Trust, the Offshore Wind Accelerator, there are similar types of organizations or public-private partnerships in Denmark and Germany that are working with industry to make sure that R&D and that innovation takes place, so that those turbines become more efficient, bigger, and better. But in terms of other public policies, when you talk about is the cost curve just changing because of economies of scale? Yes, it's economies of scale, but it's also making a market visible to industry, so that industry actually feels the pull that they know that there's going to be a set of orders in the long term, rather than this is just a small project, why would I put my best effort to sharpen my pencil and get the best numbers possible if they don't think that there's a next project and a next project and a next project? Yes. So the silver bullet policy that we see that's worked in both in Europe as well as here and is starting to work here in the United States is really making markets visible to industry, and that usually happens at the country level in Europe. So where you have national targets that are set by countries like the United Kingdom, national targets set by Belgium recently, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, France, and then here in the U.S. we're just starting to set those targets, but those targets here get set on a state level, not on a national level. So as those markets become visible, you see more competition in the market, you see more players that enter the market, you see a greater willingness to localize the supply chain, which reduces cost. So at the end of the day, you really need to have that certainty of a market. You need turbines that are going to be bigger and better. And then there's also a lot of other things that make this happen and make this happen at its lowest cost. But I would say those are the two policy actions that government needs to make and has been making to advance wind.
Great. So we have a related question from Clara, who's actually tuning in from Sweden, and she quoted that, so Sweden has about a 45% hydro and 45% nuclear load source for energy, and she's saying that because they already have all of this power, it's really hard for the wind market to break in, especially from a cost perspective, and she's asking what could be the argument for more renewables and less nuclear, specifically in this case.
It's a really good question. It's a really good point. We actually, wrestle with that question on hydro in the Northeast in states that could be getting hydro from Canada. And again, that cost difference between hydro and renewables is always one that is hard to, not hard to, but it's an interesting one to address. In terms of, I don't know the wind capacities or the wind resource in Sweden off the top of my head. I would assume that given the rest of the Scandinavian countries, that there would be a strong resource there. And I think the arguments that we always use here is really when we look at the cost of building new nuclear. So I don't know if this is a question in Sweden of, is it building new nuclear versus building new wind? Those are the kinds of questions that one, I think, has to look at. Rather than just what is the levelized cost of energy that comes from nuclear versus renewables. And so, I think if you have to get it down to an apples to apples comparison of what it costs. And so when the question is, what's the argument for renewables versus nuclear? I think it's more the question that is posed to policymakers making those decisions of, let's look at an apples to apples comparison of what it means to build new nuclear versus new renewables. And here in the US, at least, I do know that when that question is answered, nuclear has a more difficult time competing than it does when you just look at, when you take the capital cost out of it, you just look at what does it cost to generate 1 megawatt of energy, for example. I think also, again, when I don't know the geography of where nuclear plants are in Sweden, but one of the biggest, the most important issues, I think, for renewables is their locational value. So when we look at, for example, again, offshore wind is it's a big resource, and it's very closely located to where people are and where the load is. So, whether or not new nuclear plants are, having to be built far away from people because of safety concerns and risk perceived or otherwise, whether or not there is locational value added by having renewables close to the site, close to the load of where energy production is. And I'm sorry, I don't know exactly the geography and whether or not that's getting on target or not, but that's where we look at states here in the US, like New York, for example, that's really changing their thinking about renewables and not thinking so much more about least cost clean energy versus what is the value that's brought. And so you can build something that's far away from people and it's going to cost a lot of money and you're going to have a lot of losses to try to get that to load pockets versus can you build renewables close to load. And when you change that calculus, when you change the orientation from least cost to value provided, renewables look very, very different than they do from nuclear. So I hope that answers the question.
No, I think it does, and thank you very much for that. So Lewis Conway we're going to move in a bit of a different direction, but do you foresee the integration of wind technology with architecture? I mean, with our cities rising and more of our global population living in urban centers, is there a role for buildings to integrate wind power, bringing the source to the load?
I am actually not that bullish on small wind or building sited wind. They generally are not as efficient as building sited solar. And it's a much less mature market, and probably I've got somebody on the line who's in the small wind industry, and so I apologize if I'm sort of only saying the bad parts of it, but it's not as efficient. It's a less mature industry at this point, and so the turbine, the towers that they sit on, all of those are really, really in a nascent place in terms of technology development. So, is it possible? Certainly. Is it a place to, put our R&D efforts, to put our resources and our time and our energy? I think that's a question that we should be looking at as we really try to determine the best allocation of resources. But I think at this point, the kinds of architecture, green building, increasing energy efficiency, zero emission buildings, and certainly solar where it's possible. But I will go back, when you talk about urban areas and cities, I will go back to, again, making sure that we're using renewables that are closest to load. And we do have other opportunities in cities, and most cities are coastal. And so again, that's why I tend to be much more bullish on offshore wind, because you can move them out. And I would also, when we talk about the amount of things that you have to do to get wind built, so all of the permitting that you have to go through, which not only do we look at human use conflicts and environmental conflicts, but we also look at things like governmental conflicts. So we look at other stakeholders like the FAA, all of those urban cities that have airplanes and airports and all different kinds of aviation uses of the airspace. We could only go so high in urban areas on land, which I think again is another difficulty that it would face.
Okay, so Kareem had also submitted a question beforehand related, but more particular to the Sub-Saharan and Sahel region, kind of quoting, we haven't seen a lot of renewables integrated there. And I know in your course you said about the potential for offshore wind is massive. The capacity factors are much larger, the resource is just more consistent there and available. But do you see a role of it for landlocked regions and, for example, the Sahel region for land-based wind there?
Well, I would go back to the topic that I raised in the video lecture of taller towers on land, right? So there was sort of, you can do airborne wind on land, you can use taller towers. So right now, the average height of a wind turbine on land is less than 100 meters. Denmark, for example, is creating a test area to test turbines that are up to 300 meters high. Okay. So, and of course, then the US DOE, I think, is also looking at these taller towers. And you really want to get up as high as you possibly can in an economic way. And so I think that delta between how high you go, that it's still economic to build it at tall towers versus when you get into airborne wind or kites and drones and really high altitude wind, to me, that's really the more scalable, the kinds of things that we'll be able to do in large enough scale to actually make a difference in terms of climate change and reducing emissions, but also the kinds of things that we can do in large enough scale that get the economics of projects right so that we can actually build these. So that would, without knowing the history of wind in Africa, that would be my answer for sort of landlocked areas, is let's try to go taller rather than smaller.
Great. So Kareem actually had another question related to, the household level, but you've indicated maybe not your level of your area of expertise necessarily. Is there a company that's specifically working on this, or somewhere that we could point the students to do a bit more research on their own if they're interested in this small scale wind technology?
Sure. The U.S. Department of Energy has I think it's either called community wind or distributed wind, but the DOE has a pretty small program for R&D for this kind of community-sited small-scale wind power. There's also something in the United States, and so I don't know if there's something that's similar in other countries, but I think it's called the Distributed Wind Energy Association, the DWIA. So it's a trade association, and I'd be happy to. I know a few people who work in that area, and I'd be happy, Elena, to pass along some of those names afterwards to make sure that the students get. But yeah, it is something that is certainly worked on, and it's certainly something that we want to encourage. We should be taking advantage of every opportunity for individuals to want to cite renewables, to want to use it. But I'll leave it there.
Sure. No, that's great. And just so, Kareem, if you're on the line and anybody else that's interested, we'll start a discussion board with this, and then we can all maybe share some resources back and forth and take it from there. Okay, so this might be a bit challenging, but I'm going to test your expertise on the Netherlands here. So we have Wouter, who is from a small municipality in the Netherlands, and asked, what should they invest in terms of renewables? Offshore wind is not an option for them. So what would you suggest as a best alternative, and why? Maybe that's a bit hard with without some context, but we can also ask Wouter to provide more if you have any specific questions.
Yeah, so I guess the Netherlands has actually gone quite big in offshore wind. So I guess the question of why they can't use offshore wind, is it the municipality that you're asking about? That what should the municipality be investing in, or what is it in the Netherlands?
Yeah, no, the small municipality that he's from is what he's asking for.
And not knowing where it is. Maybe geographically, if you could tell us a little bit more about where it is. But, I think that, when we have cities here in the United States that don't have offshore wind or even land-based wind, cities have a real opportunity depending, and I believe that the Netherlands building codes are sort of, well regulated, I guess at the country level, but maybe at the municipality level. But usually local governments have a tremendous capacity to influence the way that buildings are built and how much energy they use. And so I didn't say this earlier in my discussion about my history, but before I even started working in the governor's office and got involved in offshore wind, I was a county official, an elected county official, and so I was the director of or the chair of the land use committee for that, and worked on green building initiatives at the local government level. And I worked really closely with the other counties all around the United States in the National Association of Counties. And we were working on climate change as a collective group of municipalities or of counties, and really did focus in on what can we do about buildings at the municipal level? What can we do about reducing vehicle miles traveled at the municipal level? And so through land use, and how many more people can we get on bikes? How many people can we get out of cars? How much more transit can we get? And so I know your question was about what should we invest in renewables, but I would say that, first I would look at how do you reduce energy, through the levers and the tools that a municipality has at its disposal, and then be that through land use planning or building codes and energy efficiency programs, but then also, what are the natural resources that you do have? And again, not knowing the geography, do you have solar that can be more wide-scale deployed. And those are things that municipalities can and do regularly play a role in incentivizing.
Yeah, so he clarified a bit for us, just that he's in Utrecht, which is in the center, and that they have a goal to be energy neutral, I assume carbon neutral by 2030, but they only have 5% renewables right now. So there's some kind of, challenge there, but it's hard to say.
I've been to Utrecht, if that is their goal, I would think that they're going to have a really strong program of energy efficiency, taking emissions or carbon emissions out of the transportation sector. And so again, I mentioned land use planning, but also electric vehicles. So even if that's the goal to reduce carbon, and I don't know what the system is. Can Utrecht buy a high level of renewable energy credits and RECs from other places in the Netherlands, like the coastal areas, like the larger RTOs that are really going in big and building a lot of offshore wind. So without knowing those connections between how the grid works and who buys from what, but on-site solar, incentivizing electric vehicles, really going really big in the building sector and the transportation sector sound like it's probably within the municipalities' actual their levers.
Great. So maybe shifting continents a little bit, we have a student from, Dorothy, I'm not sure if you're from California, but she's asking more of a California-based question. But how would you encourage the Sacramento municipality to invest in offshore wind? And is there even a market there yet? I mean, Governor Brown is very into low emissions and renewables and climate change. So what does the wind market look like there? And do you know?
I just got back from Northern California, where I spent 2 weeks on vacation and love Northern California. And actually, I have been out to Sacramento a couple of times in the past year to talk about offshore wind. It's something that the California Energy Commission, some of the commissioners on there are really looking at as they talk about going to meet the 50% goals, but then whether or not there's a 100% renewables goal that is coming and what would that mean. It's very difficult for any state to get to 100% renewables without using the offshore wind resource. Offshore wind in California is a little bit different than it is on the East Coast or even really anywhere else in the world at this point, because the deep water, as soon as you go offshore, it goes very, very deep, very, very quickly. So there is the need to use floating foundations rather than kind of monopiles that are just pile drived into the ocean floor. The first utility scale offshore wind farm is just being built off Aberdeen in Scotland, and that's happening right now. Will be commissioned later this year, probably I think in December. So that technology is rather it's maturing. But it's still very, very, very in very early stages. And so California has a real opportunity to sort of figure out how to integrate all of their assets. Because, when California can really just start to take advantage of offshore wind when it's economic, there's, land-based wind, or whether or not transmission is going to be built from Wyoming and other places in the West that are really going to truck in a lot of Midwest renewables or Western renewables to the state. What is going to be feasible when you talk about concentrating solar or utility scale solar in California. And so California has a really great opportunity on these different timelines and on these different time trajectories to put together a truly all of the above renewable energy plan in a way that a lot of states right now, kind of everything is in the mix. And so I think in terms of the sector, the municipality itself, I don't know if you mean the utility district, if you mean SMUD, or if you mean like the city of Sacramento, but I think that, the decisions about wind, about offshore wind, about those renewables are really going to happen at the state level. They're going to happen at the CPUC. They're going to happen with the CEC. But the utility itself, the ways that a lot of times these utilities can help to spur some of these sectors is to agree to make a purchase of large-scale offshore wind, or even small-scale offshore wind. There's demonstration projects that are proposed in California right now, very small scale, that are, we'll be looking for somebody to buy the offtake or buy the power from those kinds of projects. So it's there, it's happening, it's a discussion right now, and I feel really good about where it is. I don't, it's on a very different timeline than offshore wind in the United States is right here on the East Coast.
Gotcha. All right. Going more on the technology and the infrastructure side, Lewis Conway asked, what type of research is being done with turbine shape and configuration? Most seem to be propeller type. Is the propeller more efficient?
Expand on propeller type. What do you mean by propeller type? Do you mean 3 blades?
I think he means 3 blades.
Right. Okay. So the research that is really going on now in turbines has really the most to do with how big we can get, and while being economic and while being logistically feasible to deploy. So whereas we started out in the 2000s, in the aughts, I guess, and in the early 2010s, offshore wind turbines are still around 3 megawatts, 3.5 megawatt, 3.6 megawatt turbines. Today, 8 megawatts are 8 megawatt turbines are what's being installed, and already we've got 10 and 12 megawatt prototypes in action now. There are 20 megawatt turbines on the drawing board. There are discussions about, how do we get those into prototype quickly, and so bigger of the same technology is really where a lot of the industrial R&D efforts appear to be. That sort of, looking around the curve and kind of seeing what are the turbines of the future. There are, I think the most interesting one, because we talk about putting these in places where they can withstand like hurricane or even typhoon level winds. And I wish that I could toggle over to a picture or a video of it, because all I can do it is with my hand. But if you think of a palm tree, that you have a turbine that has multiple blades, and that it operates like a palm tree. And so it can be fully operational in high winds, but when the winds become too high, they fold down into themselves, and they can spin to where the turbine, to where the wind is blowing, and rearrange itself and fan back out. But without a video, I apologize for the very low tech demonstration there. So there's all kinds of really looking at, what is it that we know about how certain elements operate, or certain species operate in the wind, and what can we learn about them, and how can we design technology to do that. And there were discussions about two blade turbines, but I haven't seen it go anywhere. So, there's a lot of innovation out there in land-based wind. But I will say that, having spent a lot of time seeing what the U.S. Department of Energy, for example, is funding, is kind of looking around the curves, it has mostly to do with bigger turbines and getting them higher in the air.
Great. I think that definitely answered it, and your demonstration was definitely, it sufficed. We can use our imaginations. So kind of on the same line of thought, are there private companies who are like really pushing this forward? We know that, the old business model for utilities is really, starting to decay, and companies are re-envisioning, what they may look like in the future, in the renewable future. Who is taking, the first steps forward on wind as far as the private sector goes? Are there any big winners that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Well, there are, think about it in 2 camps. One is the people who make the technology, and then another camp are those who actually build and construct and operate offshore wind farms, generally speaking. And so on the wind, on the manufacturing side, on the equipment side, The big companies there are companies like GE, which for years have been very, very involved in land-based wind, and Siemens, which a German and Danish company, and tremendous market share of wind turbines by both Siemens and GE. A company called Vestas, which is a Danish company, and all three of those are involved in not only making turbines for onshore wind, but also for offshore wind. And got a host of others. And we see mergers all the time, so I actually don't know who's all merged with who. But there was a company called Gamesa, which has recently merged with Siemens. But I would say the big three are Siemens and Vestas and GE. We've got a company called Goldwind in China. We've got some big players in the Asian market that are Asian companies. On the other side of the companies that are building, constructing, and operating wind farms, one of the biggest is Iberdrola, which is a Spanish company. Here in the U.S., they are also Avangrid, and in the UK, they also operate under the name Scottish Renewables. So they are, very, very big company worldwide, lots of assets, lots and lots of wind farms that are in operation. There's just a ton of small developers, and then EDF Renewables, which EDF, Electricité de France, is a French company, French utility. And so these are actually, Avangrid and Iberdrola, they are utilities which now also develop, own, and operate wind farms as well. So on the offshore wind side, the global market leader is a company called Dong Energy. Dong, D-O-N-G, stands for Danish Oil and Natural Gas. They used to be an oil and gas company. They have since divested of, or in the process of divesting of, all of their fossil fuel assets to be only an offshore wind and biomass company, saying that is the future for renewables. Similarly, in Norway, Statoil. In Sweden, we still have our friend from Sweden on, Vattenfall. So a lot of these large utilities and oil and gas sector players in Europe are really have been very prominent in wind and in offshore wind. So when you say that, you see less and less of the utilities playing a role in wind, there's still a big place for them. And we've been very gratified to see them move into the U.S. and offshore wind, and we've been very gratified to see companies like Avangrid, in the U.S. with its very, very large wind portfolio. We do also have small kinds of more entrepreneurial developers, in the offshore wind space as well. But, I was actually just talking with some of the guys that were on the front end of the offshore wind world here in the United States, and there were small entrepreneurial companies, and we talked about how, in Europe there was an opportunity, there was a time, and even in onshore wind where these smaller entrepreneurial companies could make money, and we're leapfrogging right over that in the United States, where it's these big players that are coming in, and again, it's because that's what they see the future is.
Great. So kind of moving from the private sector maybe to more the NGO and these international groups, is there an international alliance on wind turbine technology that you know of? I think maybe you mentioned it earlier.
No, I didn't mention it earlier, but some of the figures and the infographics that were in the video lecture came from the Global Wind Energy Coalition. So it's the GWEC. And that is kind of the place for really all kind of global offshore wind statistics, global offshore wind, or no, sorry, I keep saying offshore wind, sorry, global wind statistics, global wind information. So where is, what's been happening, and they really are updating that information on a very regular basis. So I would look at, I think it's gwec.org. I would definitely go to them and take a look at that. But that, in terms of kind of international alliances, I think there are, each country, there's the Wind Europe, There's the American Wind Energy Association. So each country has its own kind of wind trade associations that are working on that. They're not NGOs, they're industry funded. But you know, I think the more that we create transatlantic relationships, especially when it comes to, you know, technologies that have thrived in one place and aren't thriving in another, you know, how is it? Those are the areas that we really need international cooperation on. But the GWEC, I think, operates as a place kind of where, you know, we talk about wind's place in the global fight against, climate change. That's a place where I think they better handle the discussions of that, as opposed to kind of individual country level organizations that are focused more on how do we get more share of manufacturing in a country, or how do we get more share of how do we get more built in the country. So I would encourage people to take a look at gwec.org. Now, you know, in NGO alliances for wind, I am not aware of any. I work very closely with NGOs on offshore wind, and we have very good alliances within the U.S. Organizations like the NRDC, the National Wildlife Federation, the Sierra Club, and others. But those are really the three that have been consistent and have really put resources and time into getting policies over the finish line, and not only getting wind policies over the finish line, but making sure that it's done in a way that projects are responsibly sited and that are done in a way that harmonize the building of, you know, large wind projects, and making sure that we are protecting wildlife and protecting the environment appropriately. So they're playing a huge role, but I'm just not sure of any NGO international alliances on this.
Gotcha. So I'm gonna go back. So Yvonne, sorry, I did not skip your question. I was just waiting for the right time to bring it up. So it's actually related to what you were just saying as far as the sighting goes. She brought up a question about the migrating bird species who use wind currents, you know, to follow their migration patterns. So when a place is picked to, you know, construct these wind turbines, do the migrating routes take taken into consideration? Like, do you just go ahead and use the resource, you know?
Absolutely, absolutely. I said I just returned from California, and making my way back from Sequoia National Park up into the Bay Area, I went through Altamont Pass, which was, anybody who's ever followed anything in wind, if you know, the Altamont is like, the Altamont wind is like the worst possible thing you could ever say. It's like, don't mention it, don't mention it. It was a poster child for poor sighting of wind farms for birds. It literally was built in the middle of a bird flyway, and not only was it built in the middle of a bird flyway for raptors, it was, you know, the construction created all of this rubble and all of this kind of turning over of the earth, which actually drew rodents and prey for these raptors. So not only was it through their flyway, they were coming down towards the earth to be able to go and hunt. And it was an absolute disaster environmentally. And wind and offshore wind collectively have come a long, long way since Altamont happened. And there's been not only a lot of really good learning, a lot of really good advocacy by environmental groups, but also a lot of really good policy making at the federal level and at the state level about how these get sited. So when a wind farm is going to be built, it has to go through the NEPA process, which is an Environmental Protection Act, and really takes into account you know, what the impact is going to be on this. And you have to go through an environmental impact statement before you even begin site assessment. And in terms of offshore wind, there's an environmental impact assessment done, or an environmental assessment, I should say, done before they even declare an area that's going to be appropriate for siting wind. So it's like it goes through multiple levels of, let's get the site right. After we get the site right, let's do a site assessment process that makes sure that we're even then making sure if we're going to put up a tower to measure the wind speeds, if we're going to go and we're going to bore holes in the floor to see what the geology is of the ocean floor, for example, that let's do so in a way that we are disrupting in the environment as little as we possibly can. Then when there's a construction and operations permitting, which really is, that's the big one. And that has to go through a full NEPA environmental impact assessment. And if there is not, the environmental impact is seen to be too high, it will not be permitted. There's strong requirements for mitigation. And I think what the exciting part of this is that, working with environmental organizations at the beginning of this process to figure out what are the ways that this can be mitigated, and to make sure that that from the very, very beginning, before any steps are taken, that there's a good dialogue, there's a robust engagement with stakeholders. That's really the gold standard. And the Block Island wind farm, which is the first offshore wind farm in the United States that just was built and commissioned in December of 2016, signed an agreement with the National Wildlife Federation, Oceana, NWF, a number of different environmental organizations, to say we will not construct during the migratory season for the right whale. And there are some developers, frankly, that may not have signed that. They would have said, well, let's wait and see what we can do. They just said, we're not going to do it. And there's a lot of really interesting stories told from the construction of that, which literally had to do with a whale came into the area, and they couldn't do anything until that whale left. And they were literally at the whale's whim, the whim of a whale. And but that's what they agreed to. That's what they're going to do. And I think those relationships have been built within the industry. And I think that we've learned so much more about this onshore. And the last thing that I'll say is, because it's sounding a little bit contradictory, like I'm saying, well, birds don't, we put these where birds don't fly. Birds still do fly through offshore, through wind farms. But there's a lot of work that's been done to understand how they behave. And there's a great, again, I wish I could toggle over and show you a really great graph that was done from radar that showed what birds do when they encounter a wind farm, and they go around the turbines. So, as some folks would say, they don't actually have bird brains. They see it, they know how to get through them. But I don't want to make it as sound as if we're looking at this through rose-colored glasses. There is an impact. It has to be managed. But I think we feel really confident about our ability to do that.
Great. What about radio communication? Have you ever heard of it affecting radio communication?
Between anybody? No, I mean, there's the only involvement that I would ever have had in that is, that the Department of Defense, the Navy, the Army, all of these stakeholders. That's one of the questions that they ask, is how is this going to interfere with the FAA? I mean, all of these stakeholders that you have to go through, and they actually have to sign off on these through this process of determining where wind farms are going to be sited through construction and operation permits. And so there are a number of different concerns that they raise, whether or not it be training exercises offshore, or whether or not it's flyovers, with the FAA and radio communications. But those are there's a very, very robust stakeholder process where people are all brought around the table. All of those stakeholders and individual federal agencies sit at the table with offshore wind developers, with NGOs, with community stakeholders, and ferret out where are we going to put this to make sure that we're doing it in a way that it minimizes any kinds of impacts with those kinds of human uses. But I have not heard of actual conflict with it.
Great. And so, Stephanie, you mentioned earlier about kind of the R&D potential, and you've referenced the US DOE a lot. We're definitely getting, the question here, our new administration and their new priorities, and what's kind of how much can we expect this to influence the great progress that we've made here in the US so far, and what does the future look like, especially for wind funding?
Well, that's a MOOC all on its own, isn't it? But I mean, so I'm going to break it up in terms of wind and offshore wind, because with wind there's a booming business that's already been created in this country, and there are more people employed in the Midwestern states in the wind industry than there are and will be created by any new fossil fuel jobs that the administration hopes to create. The message that comes loud and clear from wind advocates for our existing land-based wind industry in the United States is focused on the jobs, the investment, and the the opportunity that we have to create more jobs, but certainly any pullback, any things that make that industry life more difficult for that industry is actually going to lose jobs rather than have any net gain jobs from fossil fuels. The offshore wind side is not an existing industry in the United States right now. We only have 5 turbines up off the coast of Rhode Island, but we have hundreds of turbines that are proposed, that are in the queue, that are in a permitting process right now. And that is the people who are going to build those projects are going to come from the Gulf of Mexico and from the United States offshore oil and gas sector. There is very, very little difference between installing and building an offshore oil platform and building a subsea structure for an offshore wind farm. And so the synergies between the US offshore oil and gas sector and the US offshore wind sector as it grows is an opportunity for billions of dollars of investment in shipyards, in Gulf of Mexico fabrication yards for steel, for subsea structures and foundations. And there's an opportunity to bring from Europe as well a lot of other highly skilled manufacturing jobs to build turbines, to build things that are actually be closer to the deployment site, built closer to the deployment site than the Gulf of Mexico. So you're really talking about the development of coastal infrastructure that will last for generations, billions of dollars of investment. And that's the story that has to be told. And moving past and trying to make the effort to move past the ideology with the clear economic argument. And so we're involved in an effort. I'll actually be in Houston next week at a conference with oil and gas industry players and that supply chain. And this is really a conference where we are explaining and showing to them, here's the opportunity of offshore wind. This is your future as well. And we have companies like Statoil, which is again first and foremost, it is an oil and gas company. And Statoil will be there front and center, as will Dong Energy say, oil and gas was our past, and that's what we built the foundations of our company on. Our future, Statoil and Dong Energy will sit with the oil and gas sector next week and say, this is our future, and so therefore it's part of your future. And so that's the work that we're engaging in. I think we all have our nervousness and our concerns when we see things like pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, when we see kinds of studies, saying, well, grid, the renewables are killing the grid coming out of DOE. But we just need to do our work, and that's what the sector, as I know it, is deeply committed to doing.
It's great. So it's really relying on those private companies in the market right now, which is heading in that direction. So there was another related question, which kind of fits in perfect here, but about your specific activities and if you do things to raise awareness just about the opportunity of wind. So you just mentioned the conference and then the private sector, but is there any specific activities for policymakers or the general public and letting them know about this big opportunity for the future?
The majority of our work has been at the state level, making policymakers aware of the opportunity of offshore wind and the policies that are needed to be put into place to take advantage of this large-scale renewable resource in a way that the economics of projects can work. That's really been the bulk of what we do. We don't engage in kind of general public level education about offshore wind. We work very closely with our NGO partners who I've mentioned before, and I'll give them a shout out again, the Sierra Club, the NWF, the NRDC. We work really, really closely with them because they're the ones who do that kind of grassroots education as well as grassroots advocacy. But we've really specialized in, done a couple of things, really focusing on the biggest markets that could actually have a potential to do this in the biggest way. So here in the US, that's Massachusetts and New York. And so we work with policymakers. We have done analysis directly for policymakers to be able to help them to show them what the economics are, the policy proposals that they would need to engage in, and the actual effect that those policies would have on reducing costs, which is really what they care about. We host trips. We took 13 members of the Massachusetts legislature to Europe in September of 2015, 2 weeks before an Energy Committee hearing. Got them all educated and excited about wind, and they came home, and sure enough, out of that Energy Committee hearing came a bill that ultimately led to a creation of a pipeline of offshore wind projects that was signed by the governor about 6 or 8 months later after that trip. So a combination of analysis and information, communications about that kind of policy and cost trajectory that's a little bit more wonky, that goes directly to policymakers. That's what we do. And so in California, when I said I've been out there a couple of times in the past year, people are always talking to me about what can you do here in California to do some of the other work. Some of the other set of our activities that we do is we actually convene and bring together federal policymakers, state policymakers, NGOs, industry members, academics in some cases. We convene those guys a couple of times a year, and frankly, since Donald Trump was elected, we started convening. I think we've convened them 5 times this year, whereas normally we convene maybe once or twice. But we get everybody kind of together. We bring people who are all on the front lines of trying to advance wind energy to say, how can we be better rowing in the same direction? And so it's less educating them about the opportunity, but bringing the people who are working on it together to really try to lead in a way that harmonizes our activities, maximizes the efficiencies of what we're doing, and make sure that those people who aren't regularly talking to NGOs or aren't regularly talking to state policymakers, everybody understands the perspective, point of view, and needs of everybody else in that on those front lines. So those are some of the activities that we do trying to advance this.
Stephanie, are any of those calculations available publicly? You mentioned some of the economics that you presented to policymakers. I would just love to be able to share those resources with the students that are interested specifically in that side of it.
Sure. On the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind website, okay. We have our New York study posted, as well as our Massachusetts study posted. We also have the press releases and the executive summaries of those as well on that site. The Massachusetts study was the New York one is literally, you know, it's the soup to nuts kind of approach of here's what the cost looks like it's going to be as we move into the future from changes of technology, and, you know, little by little, step by step, here's each of the policies that you need to take, and ultimately where you can get to. And what's really interesting is we did that study. It was published in early 2015, but we did the study, conducted it in 2014. And where we said that we expected the cost of wind to get to by now, we've already surpassed that. You know, so it's sort of a testament. Also, if you take a look at it, it's a testament of how quickly these innovations are moving. Because, you know, we were relatively conservative in our approach, but they've just blown our expectations away. So, and the Massachusetts one is a little bit of a shorter read. It's a very much more focused on, like, here's what these costs of these projects could be, you know, if you make a commitment to large scale wind, as opposed to if you also have this kind of contracting and if you also do these kinds of construction activities. So if you want the soup to nuts, look at the New York study. If you want a little quick read on what costs are expected to be in the US, check out the Massachusetts study.
Great. And Stephanie, I just want to ask you real quick, we have like about 2 more questions. Do you mind if we go a couple minutes over, or do we We happy? Okay, great. So kind of going back to the conference that you're going to be going to in the private sector, someone asked specifically about Chevron, and I'm curious, are they going to be at the conference, do you know of? And
no.
No.
I do not believe so. I'm not running the conference. I'm just trying to help make it happen, and I will be there on a panel. But I don't believe that Chevron is going to be there. However, I gave a presentation on offshore wind a couple of, I don't know, maybe it was a year ago, and I got a call from folks at Chevron about it, and I ended up having the opportunity to present and do an educational opportunity for their young leaders in engineering, I think it was, group. So, you know, at least I was heartened that there is a willingness and an interest and an openness to looking at, you know, what are the technologies of the future going to be in renewables and where it relates to offshore energy. And we had a really good group and a really good discussion. And so I was encouraged by that, but I don't expect them to be at the conference next week. I will say the other company, oil and gas, I did mention Statoil and I mentioned Dong, but Shell, Royal Dutch Shell. I don't know that if they're going to be there next week or not, but Royal Dutch Shell in the Netherlands, if our friend from the Netherlands is still on, has actually been a pretty big player in wind, in offshore wind, and in land-based wind. But I think they're waiting to see how some things shape up in the U.S. before they jump into it, if they do. But you know, this is what they're looking at, and you know, it's on us to make sure that we're being inclusive, that we're getting the messages out to the right audiences, and so I was really happy to have that opportunity with Chevron.
Yeah, so bringing up Koch and then others and other big oil specifically, students are asking, how do we get them to leave it in the ground without just, you know, obviously paying them outright for it? But
not an area that I work on. I actually work on trying to get them to understand their diversification opportunities, and one can hope that, you know, as they diversify, they leave more and more in the ground when they see what they can do without the blowback that they get. You know, I mean, it's sort of right, it's all sectors triangulating. So, you know, the extent to which they're able to see opportunities and see diversification, and as they're getting the pressure from, you know, the ENGO sector, and while they're having policies put into place that are limiting what they can take out of the ground, they need to have other pathways and have other opportunities, and you know, that's what it is that we want them to understand, and that's the part that I work on.
Sure. Okay, and then I'm going to say last question, or I have two more questions, but I'm going to shut it off so that we can end at a reasonable time. But on the environmental side, and specifically, you know, the migratory birds that we talked about, so obviously in poor or developing countries, they'd have less of a capacity to do these really thorough environmental assessments. So would you say that we should not promote then wind in these areas that maybe can't do it as thoroughly?
That's a good question, and certainly not one, since I'm not working on wind in developing countries at this point, certainly not one that I have had to grapple with. But I will channel my friends from the National Wildlife Federation, who have been, like I said, on the forefront of offshore wind, as well as the Sierra Club. But when I say channel my friends from the National Wildlife Federation, because I have heard this say this again and again and again, as they promote offshore wind, because they're asked these questions all the time. You know, isn't this going to kill birds? Isn't this going to harm marine life? The larger threat to wildlife is climate change than it is the building and construction and operating of, you know, of renewable energy. And so, you know, I don't feel comfortable answering the question like, oh, forget about the birds in developing countries. That's a huge part of, you know, the ecosystem and the entire, context of these countries. And I certainly don't want to answer the question to say, don't worry about it, you know, worry more about climate change. But I just would leave you with that thought that these are all factors that have to be put on the table when you come down to making a decision about what is it that we need to do as a country, what are our opportunities, what are our goals, and frankly, what are our biggest threats.
Great. Okay, so I'm just going to ask one last question to finish up here, and I'm trying to finish every session with this, but you know, we're speaking to students here, so people who are already working in renewables or maybe thinking about going into this industry. What would be, you know, the skill set or the background that somebody should be work on building if they were interested, you know, to work in wind? And this could be in the U.S. context or globally, because it's obviously a really big opportunity in the future, or hopefully.
Yes. Well, my number one skill set that I believe that people in this field need to have is leadership. Leadership, leadership, leadership. Because I have seen again and again, I've seen great engineers with great R&D ideas, but if they're toiling away in a university, punching numbers into a calculator, and not able to move their technology forward, you know, then it doesn't really go anywhere. I've seen really committed environmentalists who, you know, they completely understand all of the science of climate change and all of what we need to do. If they're not able to communicate and to lead in a way that actually is going to make that information usable, then their advocacy is going to be thwarted and it's going to be stalled. And, you know, again, I'm not a technology person. I didn't start in this world as a technology person, as a science person. I started as a policy person, and frankly, again, what I also didn't mention in my bio is when I was on the faculty at the University of Delaware before leaving to go into the government, I was actually a professor of leadership and public policy. That's what my background is in. So this is, I'm also stating my bias here, is that this is what I used to do for a living, was train students and teach students about leadership and how to lead in the public policy sector. So, I mean, you know, it's this critical skill sets that we need just generally, you know, in terms of critical thinking. How can you look at information that you are given and critically analyze that information? You know, you don't have to become a scientist to be able to be an effective steward of your environment or an effective advocate for the kinds of things that we need to do to deal with climate change. You need to be able to critically review and analyze and then communicate about the good and the bad information that is out there, is to be able to beat back the misinformation and put forward good information. So I think, you know, we each have our own skill sets. We're going to have scientists who are going to do this work. We're going to have technology experts and engineers who are going to be innovative and brilliant and come up with new things. What I believe we need is we need a cadre of new leaders that are going to have the energy and the passion and the skills to be able to move us forward and take all of that great information that people are developing and building, and how do we make it usable to the general public, to policymakers at everything from the community level, the municipal level, the state level, the national level, and the international level. So go lead.
Well, we obviously have a set of motivated students here who are taking the course anyway, so I have high hopes that they will all take this leadership message to heart. So thank you, Stephanie, so much for your time, and everybody that's been watching all online. I'm just going to do a quick shout out to remind everyone that we also have Jeff Sachs doing a Q&A with us Thursday this week, so please tune in again. And any specific questions that you have for Stephanie, just let us know and we can try and get them for her if they weren't answered today. But thank you again.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.